In 701 BC, the Assyrian Empire was the largest and most powerful state the Near East had yet produced. 20 years earlier, that same empire had ended the independent existence of the northern kingdom of Israel. Its army marched on the capital, Samaria, held it under siege for 3 years, and when the city was captured in 722 BC, deported its population east into Assyrian territory. 10 tribes of Israel went into that deportation and never returned. They are still referred to today as the 10 lost tribes. Only one kingdom remained of what had once been the United Nation of Israel: Judah in the southern hill country, with one major city, Jerusalem, and no army capable of meeting Assyria in open battle. In the summer of 701 BC, the same empire that had ended the north marched south. 46 fortified cities of Judah were captured within weeks. Then the Assyrian army reached Jerusalem and surrounded it. Every source describing what happened next, the Hebrew Bible, the Assyrian king's own inscriptions, and the physical remains still standing in Jerusalem today, agrees on one point: Jerusalem was never captured by the Assyrian army. What they disagree on, and what historians have debated for more than a century, is why. According to the biblical account, in a single night, 185,000 Assyrian soldiers died in their camp outside the city, and an army that had never lost a siege went home without one. This is an account of how a kingdom that had already watched its neighbor destroyed prepared for the same fate, what the invading king's own record says happened, and what archaeology has found in the ground beneath both stories. Hezekiah became king of Judah around 727 BC. His father, Ahaz, had paid tribute to Assyria for years and had allowed altars to foreign gods inside the temple in Jerusalem. Hezekiah reversed this immediately. He removed the foreign altars, restored temple worship according to the law of Moses, and according to the biblical record in 2 Kings, trusted in the God of Israel more than any king of Judah before or after him. Early in his reign in 722 BC, Assyria completed its conquest of the northern kingdom. Refugees fled south into Judah, and Jerusalem's population grew well beyond what its existing walls enclosed. Hezekiah watched the destruction of the north from a position of vassalage. Judah was still paying annual tribute to Assyria, and was still, in theory, protected by that arrangement. That changed in 705 BC, when the Assyrian king Sargon II died in battle. Across the empire, vassal kings read the death of a king as an opportunity, and several stopped paying tribute at once, calculating that a new ruler would be occupied securing his own succession rather than immediately punishing distant provinces. Hezekiah was one of them. He stopped sending tribute to Sargon's son and successor Sennacherib, formed an alliance with the Philistine city of Ashkelon, and opened negotiations with Egypt. He also began preparing Jerusalem for the war this decision would bring. The preparations were specific and physical, and much of what Hezekiah built still exists. Jerusalem's water supply came from a single source outside the city walls, the Gihon Spring, a weakness an enemy could simply seize during a siege. Hezekiah ordered a tunnel cut through solid bedrock to carry the spring's water inside the walls to a new reservoir, the Pool of Siloam. While the original spring opening outside the walls was concealed, 2 teams of workers cut the tunnel from opposite ends and met in the middle, a detail confirmed by an inscription carved into the tunnel wall itself, discovered in 1880 and now held in the Istanbul Archaeological Museum. The finished tunnel ran roughly 1,750 feet through solid rock. Separately, according to 2 Chronicles 32, Hezekiah blocked the streams outside the city, built a new wall around Jerusalem's western hill to enclose the refugee population, raised additional towers, manufactured weapons and shields in quantity, and appointed military commanders over the people. A section of that wall, 7 meters thick, still stands today in Jerusalem's Jewish quarter and is known as the Broad Wall. It has traditionally been credited to Hezekiah's preparations. Recent carbon dating suggests part of it may have been started slightly earlier, under King Uzziah, though it stood as Judah's main western fortification through Hezekiah's reign and the Assyrian invasion. By this point, Jerusalem's population had grown considerably beyond its earlier boundaries, reaching an estimated 25,000 people across roughly 125 acres, as refugees arrived from the fallen northern kingdom. A city holding that many people needed a secure water source more than almost anything else, which is why Hezekiah's tunnel was among the first projects his government undertook. None of this reads as blind confidence. It reads as a government that expected a siege and built specifically for one. What Hezekiah was preparing for had a method behind it, refined by Assyria over more than a century of conquest. Assyrian siege warfare did not depend only on battering rams and ramps. It depended equally on the reputation those weapons had already earned. Cities that resisted and lost were turned into demonstrations for every other city watching. Populations were deported in the tens or hundreds of thousands, breaking any possibility of continued local resistance. Captured leaders were executed in public, and Assyrian royal inscriptions described these executions in specific detail, written to be read aloud and repeated. The purpose was to make surrender look like the only rational choice before a single soldier reached the walls. This was documented policy, applied by multiple Assyrian kings across generations, not the improvisation of one unusually cruel general. Every city Sennacherib's army captured on the route to Jerusalem also functioned as evidence, presented in advance to the city still ahead of him. Sennacherib's third campaign, in the spring of 701 BC, moved down the eastern Mediterranean coast. Sidon was captured. Ashkelon's king was removed and replaced with a ruler loyal to Assyria. An Egyptian relief force marching to support the rebellion was defeated at El-Teka. Ekron surrendered without a fight. The Assyrian army then turned inland toward Judah. Sennacherib's own annals, carved into a six-sided clay object known today as the Sennacherib Prism, or the Taylor Prism, list 46 fortified cities and countless smaller villages of Judah captured at this stage of the campaign, along with more than 200,000 people deported together with their livestock. The most important of these 46 cities, after Jerusalem itself, was Lachish, roughly 30 miles southwest of the capital. Lachish sat on a hill, and its walls could not be reached without an elevated approach, so the Assyrian army built one. Archaeological analysis of the ramp still visible at the site today, the only Assyrian siege ramp preserved anywhere in the region, estimates it required close to 3 million stones, weighing a combined 20,000 tons, built in as little as 20 to 25 days by hundreds of laborers working in continuous shifts, protected from arrows and stones by large wicker shields. Once the ramp reached the wall, wheeled siege engines carrying battering rams weighing close to a ton each were hauled up it. An iron chain from one of these rams was recovered by archaeologists at the site. Lachish was captured. Its leaders were executed, its population deported, and the siege was commemorated by Sennacherib in a way no other event of his reign was. A continuous relief carving, 8 feet tall and 80 feet long, wrapped around an entire room of his palace at Nineveh, showing the ramp, the siege engines, the deportation, and the king seated on a throne reviewing the captives. That relief is on public display today in the British Museum. Of everything Sennacherib's third campaign accomplished, Lachish is the only engagement he chose to commemorate at this scale inside his own palace. Jerusalem does not appear on any wall of it. While Lachish was under siege, Sennacherib sent 3 senior officials ahead to Jerusalem to negotiate its surrender before a siege of the capital became necessary. Their titles, preserved in the biblical account, were the Tartan, the Rabsaris, and the Rabshakeh, Assyrian court titles rather than personal names. It was the Rabshakeh who spoke. He stood outside Jerusalem's wall at the conduit of the upper pool and addressed 3 of Hezekiah's officials, Eliakim, Shebna, and Joah. Eliakim asked him to speak in Aramaic, the language of diplomacy, rather than Hebrew, so the ordinary people standing on the wall above would not understand him and lose confidence. The Rabshakeh refused and raised his voice and spoke in Hebrew for exactly the reason Eliakim feared. He asked the people on the wall what they were trusting in. He told them Egypt was a bruised reed that would pierce the hand of anyone who leaned on it. He also offered an alternative. If the people made peace with Assyria and came out to him, each man could eat from his own vine and his own fig tree and drink from his own well, until Sennacherib came to take them to a land as good as their own, an offer of comfortable exile from the same king whose army had already deported the populations of 46 other Judean towns. He told them their trust in their own God was pointless, since Hezekiah had personally torn down that God's altars across the countryside. Then he made the argument that mattered most. He listed the gods of nations Assyria had already conquered: Hamath, Arpad, Sepharvaim, and asked where those gods were now. He named Samaria directly, the northern kingdom's own capital, destroyed 20 years earlier, and asked the people of Jerusalem why their God should be any different from the gods that had failed to save it. Under Hezekiah's orders, the people on the wall said nothing back. Hezekiah's officials reported the speech to him with their clothes torn, a customary sign of grief. Hezekiah tore his own clothes, put on sackcloth, and went to the temple. He sent Eliakim and Shebna to the prophet Isaiah with a specific message. This was a day of distress, and perhaps God had heard the Rabshakeh mock him directly and would answer for it. Isaiah's reply, delivered back through the same officials, was precise. Sennacherib would hear a report, return to his own country, and die there by the sword. He would not enter Jerusalem, would not fire a single arrow into it, and would not raise a siege ramp against it. He would leave by the same road he had arrived on. Isaiah's message also answered Sennacherib directly, stating that his past victories had happened only because God had allowed them, not because Assyria's power was independent of it, and that Sennacherib's own pride would now work against him. As a sign the prophecy would hold, Isaiah told Hezekiah that the fields around Jerusalem, left unplanted during the siege, would produce enough on their own for 2 years, and only in the 3rd year would ordinary planting resume. The report Sennacherib heard, according to the biblical account, concerned Tirhakah, a member of the Cushite royal family ruling Egypt, reported to be marching out to meet the Assyrian army. Some historians propose that the biblical account may combine 2 separate Assyrian campaigns against Judah, one in 701 BC and a second roughly a decade later, into a single narrative, based on chronological difficulties in reconciling every detail of the account. Before withdrawing to deal with the reported threat, Sennacherib sent Hezekiah one more message, repeating the same argument the Rabshakeh had made at the wall. No god of any nation Assyria had fought had ever saved that nation, and Hezekiah's God would not save Jerusalem either. Hezekiah carried this letter into the temple, spread it open on the floor, and prayed there, asking specifically that the kingdoms of the earth would know that the Lord alone was God. That night, according to 2 Kings Isaiah and 2 Chronicles, all 3 of which record the event in nearly identical terms, an angel of the Lord went out into the Assyrian camp. The next morning, 185,000 men were dead. The text gives no further description of how. There is no described battle, no named commander who witnessed it, no account of Judean soldiers taking the field at all. The record states that a specific number of men in a specific army were alive one night and dead the next morning, and that Sennacherib broke camp and returned to Nineveh without his army and without Jerusalem. 2 Kings closes its account there. Sennacherib's own record closes in a different place entirely. The Sennacherib prism describes 46 cities captured, hundreds of thousands of people and animals taken as spoil, and Hezekiah himself, in the prism's own words, shut up like a bird in a cage inside Jerusalem. Every other city in the campaign is described as captured. Jerusalem is described only as surrounded. This is not a small omission. Assyrian royal inscriptions were composed to record total victories for the historical record and for the king's own legacy, and they routinely inflated numbers and outcomes rather than admit failure. An inscription that boasts of trapping a king inside his own capital lists an enormous tribute payment received from him, and then stops without ever claiming the capital itself, is, by the ordinary standard of this kind of document, an admission. It is the one detail Sennacherib's account and the biblical account agree on without contradiction. Whatever happened at Jerusalem, the city was still standing, and still Hezekiah's, when the Assyrian army left. For the remainder of his reign, Sennacherib's campaigns were directed elsewhere, into Babylonia and the mountains east of Assyria. Judah continued paying tribute as a vassal state, but Sennacherib's army did not return to it. Physical evidence for the campaign exists on both sides of this account. At Lachish, the destruction layer, the siege ramp, the arrowheads and sling stones remain in the ground. In Jerusalem, Hezekiah's tunnel still carries water from the Gihon spring to the pool of Siloam and can still be walked today, and the broad wall still stands in the Jewish quarter. The Sennacherib prism survives in multiple copies, one in the British Museum, one at the Oriental Institute in Chicago, one in the Israel Museum in Jerusalem, each recording the same campaign in the same words. The Siloam inscription itself was found by accident in 1880, when boys playing inside the tunnel noticed lettering cut into the rock near its southern end, leading to one of the earliest confirmed discoveries of Hebrew script from this period. The Sennacherib prism was not composed during the campaign itself. Its text is dated to roughly 691 BC, about a decade after the events it describes, meaning Sennacherib's scribes had 10 years to decide exactly how the Jerusalem campaign should be worded for the historical record, and still did not claim the city. There is also a third, independent account of what happened to Sennacherib's army that year, and it comes from neither Judah nor Assyria. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly 250 years later, recorded a story told to him by Egyptian priests during his travels there. In this version, Sennacherib's army advanced on Egypt rather than Jerusalem, and the Egyptian king, abandoned by his own warrior class, prayed inside a temple and was told in a dream that help would come. That night, according to Herodotus, a large number of field mice moved through the Assyrian camp and gnawed through the soldiers' bowstrings, quivers, and shield straps, and by morning the army could not fight and withdrew. Herodotus reports that a statue of the Egyptian king, holding a mouse, stood in an Egyptian temple for centuries afterward, inscribed with an instruction to anyone who looked at it to respect the gods. Herodotus places the event in Egypt rather than Judah, and credits Egyptian gods rather than the God of Israel, but the underlying pattern, a powerful invading army disabled overnight by a force too small to fight in any conventional military sense, is close enough to the biblical account that historians have long treated the two as separate cultural memories of the same disaster. What actually disabled Sennacherib's army in 701 BC remains genuinely unresolved among historians, and the available evidence supports more than one explanation without confirming any single one on its own. Some historians point to the Babylonian Chronicle, which records renewed rebellion in Babylon during this same period, and argue Sennacherib may have needed to withdraw his forces to deal with a more urgent political crisis at home. Others point to Herodotus's account of mice destroying military equipment. Note that mice and rats are established carriers of the fleas that transmit plague, and argue that an outbreak of disease moving through an army camped in one place for weeks is a documented and recurring cause of sudden troop losses throughout ancient and medieval military history. A smaller number of historians argue that the approach of Tirhakah's Egyptian and Cushite force was, on its own, enough to end the siege. The biblical text identifies the cause directly as the act of an angel of the Lord, and treats this as the central point of the narrative rather than an incidental detail. Ancient and modern readers of this event have not generally treated these explanations as strict alternatives requiring a single verdict. What is not in dispute, in the biblical account, in the Assyrian account, or in Herodotus's account, is the same basic outcome: an army that had not lost a battle left without winning one, and did not leave because it was defeated in the field. Sennacherib returned to Nineveh and continued to rule Assyria for another 20 years. He was not immediately destroyed or disgraced by the outcome at Jerusalem. He expanded Nineveh into the largest city in the world at that time, laying out new roads, constructing a new palace, and completing large irrigation projects. In 689 BC, he destroyed Babylon outright in response to yet another rebellion there, an act that reportedly disturbed his own court and priesthood, since Babylon held deep religious significance across Mesopotamia. In 681 BC, 20 years after the Jerusalem campaign, while Sennacherib was worshipping in the temple of his god Nisroch in Nineveh, two of his own sons, named in the biblical account as Adramelech and Sharezer, killed him there with a sword. This event is independently recorded in the Babylonian Chronicle, which dates the killing to a specific day in the Assyrian month of Tebet in 681 BC, and in the inscriptions of Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, who describes marching on Nineveh to put down the rebellion after his brothers fled north into the region of Ararat. The biblical account and the Assyrian record agree that Sennacherib died at the hands of his own sons, in his own capital, inside the temple of the god he worshipped, 20 years after standing outside Jerusalem and asking why that city's god would be any different from every other god his army had already conquered. The failure to capture Jerusalem mattered beyond the events of a single campaign season, for three specific reasons. First, it is one of the only recorded instances of a walled capital resisting the Assyrian military, at the height of its power and remaining standing afterward, an outcome rare enough that Assyria's own scribes, who recorded total victories as a matter of routine, never recorded this one as a defeat. Second, 20 years earlier, the northern kingdom of Israel had been destroyed under nearly identical pressure, its population deported, and its identity absorbed into the wider Assyrian Empire. Judah's survival in 701 BC meant that outcome was not repeated a second time in the same century. The line of kings descending from David, the temple in Jerusalem, and the religious and textual tradition that eventually produced the Hebrew Bible in its current form all continued specifically because Jerusalem was not captured the way Samaria had been. Third, this event became, and remains, one of the most heavily cross-referenced episodes from the ancient Near East, described independently by the people it happened to, the empire that caused it, and a foreign historian who heard a distorted version of it 250 years later in a different country entirely. Very few events from this period in history left this much surviving independent evidence. Much of it can still be seen today. Hezekiah's tunnel still runs beneath the city of David, and water still moves through it toward the pool of Siloam. The broad wall still stands a few streets away, thick enough that visitors can see exactly what a government preparing for the worst siege of its history chose to build. In London, inside the British Museum, the Lachish reliefs and the Sennacherib prism sit only a short walk apart, one describing a city that was captured, the other listing every city that was, and naming the one that was not.